The single most important issue in the policy debate was NEP, was the new economic policy, and how best to build a socialist society. In the first phase of the succession struggle, Trotsky was the first to argue that the mixed economy of NEP was leading to capitalism and not to socialism. He proposed accelerating the growth of socialist industry by increasing the taxes on the capitalist peasantry. He and his followers, notably Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, referred to this as primitive socialist accumulation. That much is straightforward, but you must keep two things in mind. First, all the contenders for power twisted and caricatured their opponents' ideas if it gave them an advantage. Second, policy positions were dynamic, changing, logically, as circumstances changed. So did the views of politicians. Now, Stalin's program, which is referred to as socialism in one country, was intended as a dig on Trotsky, who had argued after the revolution that to build a socialist society in Russia, there would need to be revolution abroad. That is, that Russia would need assistance from abroad. Now, Trotsky no longer pressed this idea after it had become clear that there was no prospect of revolution in Europe. But Stalin did not let him forget his earlier words, because it made him look like a defeatist. Meanwhile, Stalin also responded to Trotsky's idea of primitive socialist accumulation with a defense of NEP and a warning that increasing taxes on the peasantry would put the very real successes of the NEP economy at risk. It seemed a sensible position in the early 1920s when NEP was generating double-digit growth. By 1925, Trotsky had been isolated. Was that because of the inferiority of his ideas? Probably not. The reason for Trotsky's isolation were more personal than political or ideological. The fact of the matter is, nobody in the Politburo liked him. He was arrogant. He was not a team player. The members of the Politburo couldn't imagine running the country under his leadership. And that, rather than his policies, was Trotsky's main weakness. Meanwhile, things in the rest of the Politburo were not especially happy. Nikolai Bukharin had become perhaps an over-enthusiastic supporter of NEP and a reliance on its capitalist elements, that is, the well-to-do peasant, the kulak, and the petty trader, the NEP man. Zinoviev and Kamenev did not share Bukharin's willingness to embrace NEP capitalism. They also worried that Stalin was accumulating too much personal power. And the combination of the personal and political encouraged them to break with the Politburo majority and join their old enemy Trotsky and form the united opposition. Together, they attacked NEP, and together, the majority defended NEP, though not exactly in the same terms. NEP was still generating substantial rates of growth, though everyone knew that substantial new investment in industry would be necessary for those rates of growth to remain high. Stalin emphasized the importance of central planning and measures to improve industrial efficiency in generating new investment. Bukharin acknowledged these, but insisted that capitalist elements would have to continue to play an important role in the economy. Now, many historians have argued that Stalin used the policies of the right to defeat the left, and then adopted the policies of the left to defeat the right. That Stalin, in this sense, was an unprincipled political opportunist. These historians fail to see that by the mid-1920s, as the prospect of the first five-year plan came to be seen as providing solutions to the problems of NEP, the whole of the party elite was moving to the left. Stalin and the Politburo majority defeated the united opposition because in 1927 there was little to separate the promise of their economic policies. Why risk a change when the majority was achieving good results? Again, Stalin was able to present his opponents as splitters, as pointlessly challenging central policy. The last phase of the policy debate was between Stalin and Bukharin, both of whom continued to drift to the left. The last phase of the policy debate was between Stalin and Bukharin, both of whom continued to drift to the left. Stalin shared with the Politburo majority a growing enthusiasm about the potential of the five-year plan. Bukharin was willing to accept that more would have to be done to contain capitalist elements, but he thought that Stalin was going too far, that Stalin's harsh measures against wealthy peasants after 1920, or in 1928 and after, were dangerous. He also publicly worried that enthusiasm for the plan was going too far, that plans were not realistic. You cannot, to use his words, build today's factories with tomorrow's bricks. Bukharin's worries were well placed. The plans were unrealistic. The confrontation with the peasantry proved devastating. But he predicted a crisis that didn't come until the early 1930s. And while he issued warnings of doom, output figures continued to rise beyond expectations. Yet again, Stalin could present his opponents as blind to the correctness of central policy, as unnecessary ballast best cast overboard. In short, again, as splitters. In 1929, Bukharin and his followers were cast aside, and from that point, Stalin's rule never again faced a serious challenge. Now that takes us to our next factor, that is the political culture of the Bolshevik Party, of Bolshevism. Remember that in the 1950s and 1960s, historians only really ever looked at high politics. If Stalin controlled the party machine, as they believed, through the Secretariat, then there was no point in looking anywhere else. But when in the 1970s and 80s, historians started to take policy debates seriously, then suddenly it mattered who those policies were being presented to. Was it to the millions-strong party rank and file? Was it being presented to the several thousand top party officials? 20 years after the revolution, at a small get-together in the Kremlin after the Red Square parade, Stalin reminisced about the power struggle to his close associates in the Politburo. There, he stressed the importance of his overwhelming popularity among the broad party rank and file. He was almost certainly right about this. The rank and file were, for the most part, barely literate and knew little of Marxism-Leninism. They were the most comfortable with the authoritarian traditions of Tsarism and the least likely to understand the complexities of the policy debates. They were likely to be the most happy for those policy debates to come to an end. They appreciated Stalin's efforts to explain Leninism in very simple terms and were drawn to his self-presentation as Lenin's one true disciple. It is not difficult to see how Stalin could rely on their support. But what's more striking about Stalin's reminiscences is that his praise for the rank and file implies a criticism of, a lack of trust in senior officialdom. This group had higher levels of education. They understood the terms of the policy debates. They did not need Stalin's simplifications of Leninism. They knew that Trotsky and Bukharin were more sophisticated thinkers than Stalin. Now, this didn't mean that they naturally opposed Stalin. Stalin had always presented himself as representing the middle ground, as leader of the majority. He moved to the left as they moved to the left. And his policies were generally successful. The economy continued to grow rapidly through the 1920s, despite predictions to the contrary from his opponents, from the left and from the right. Stalin seemed to be a safe pair of hands. He carried the support of the party elite too, but he was aware that their support was conditional, less certain, more measured. The support of the party elite was most important to the leadership struggle because they, or at least the top 175 or 200 officials represented within the party's central committee, they were empowered by party rules to elect the Politburo. They had it in their power to remove Stalin, but they did not. They supported Stalin, but Stalin knew it was a close-run thing. The Great Terror of 1936 to 38 was in no small part driven by Stalin's fear that he could not rely on their loyalty. So by way of a summary, let's return to the question. Do Stalin's strengths or his opponent's weaknesses better explain his victory? In short, Stalin's strengths mattered more. What were they? One, his position as General Secretary of the party. Two, his ability to hold the majority of the Politburo. Three, his ceaseless attention to the details of factional politics. Four, the success of his policies. And five, his popularity among the rank and file of the party. And briefly on his opponent's weaknesses. One, Trotsky was unpopular and distrusted within the Politburo. Two, neither he nor Zinoviev and Kamenev within the United Opposition, none of them removed Stalin when they had the chance. Three, Trotsky didn't play the game of factional politics. He lost opportunities. Four, Bukharin's ideas, later in the 1920s, were out of tune with a party drifting to the left.